Meredith, you're muted. Meredith, you're muted.
Okay, we're going to try this one more time. Can everyone hear me? Yes? Okay. So happy to see you all today on Friday. My name is Meredith Ellenger. I'm a practicing architect in the DC metro area, and I'm the co-chair and co-founder of the Committee on Architecture for Education for the AIA Northern Virginia chapter. Welcome to Celebrating Equity of DeafSpace Design, which is a virtual panel and film screening exploring equitable design at Gallaudet University based in Washington, DC. So before starting, I'd like to talk briefly about our committee. The CAE is a national knowledge community with the American Institute of Architects and serves as a forum for architects, educators, and civic leaders that promote the exchange of ideas, best practices, and resources around learning environment design. You can learn more about our CAE chapter on the AIA Northern Virginia website. To give you some background, this film screening is the first of a three-part series that the CAE NOVA committee will be hosting this year. Prior to planning this event, our committee collectively discussed 4 big topics to explore in the design of learning environments for each quarter of this year, and each of the films will be taking a point of view on each topic. This quarter's topic is justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, with the intent to raise awareness on how designers, educators, and civic leaders can advocate for more equitable design and push for these concepts in our communities. The DeafSpace design guidelines created and implemented at Gallaudet campus serves as an excellent example that we can learn from. The 2 short films we will be showing provide a glimpse into this campus's political history, student community, and campus design. Additionally, the subsequent presentations and panel with Gallaudet and Quinn Evans will deliver a more in-depth look at DeafSpace design and how it was incorporated into the university architecture and urban design. And please don't forget, as Ria mentioned, we're eager to know where everyone in the audience is from today, so please drop a hello in the chat below with your name, what you do, and where you are. Next slide. Before introducing our panel, we'd like to thank our 3 event sponsors, Gallaudet University, MDN Architects, and HCM. Also, thank you to all of our community volunteers who helped make today's webinar possible. Next slide. We have 3 people on our panel today, which I'll be introducing in order of appearance. First is Christopher Hoffman, who's an architectural designer and certified interior designer. He's a manager of design services and space planning within the Office of Campus Design and Facilities at Gallaudet University. His passion is educating people about DeafSpace, which is a design that removes barriers from the built environment for deaf people. Following Chris is Derek Bamhoza, who is an urban planner and a DeafSpace engagement and design consultant. He is also currently working as a development specialist at Gallaudet University. And last but not least is Megan Tormey, who is an architect at Quinn Evans and specializes in the design of performing arts and cultural spaces. Megan believes that good inclusive design stems from careful attention to the needs of clients, users, and stakeholders. Megan was the project architect for the renovation of the Ballard and Fay houses and the new construction of the Learning and Living Residence Hall 6 at Gallaudet University. It was through this work with Gallaudet where she first learned about DeafSpace design principles and how they could all be applied to all projects. Chris, take it away.
Thank you, Meredith, for that introduction. Greetings, everyone, and happy Friday. Thank you to AIA and the Committee on Architects for Education and the Northern Virginia chapter of the AIA for hosting this event and inviting me to be part of this. And thank you to all of you who are attending and taking time out of your workday to join us. I am thrilled to be taking you on this exploration today into what we call DeafSpace design. Before we begin our exploration, please keep your eyes peeled. We hope that in doing so, you'll find and learn to appreciate design of the space and apply that to a variety of cultures and incorporate that into your own design and work. So join me on my journey and explore DeafSpace and its application to value the deaf community here at Gallaudet University. Let me give you a brief history of Gallaudet University because you may not realize what's so special about Gallaudet. Gallaudet was founded in 1864 by a charter under the then President Abraham Lincoln. Gallaudet University is a world-renowned leader in liberal arts education and career development for deaf and hard of hearing students. This space was created to value culture and linguistic development and ASL vibrancy. This is truly a unique place. The university's mission is toward bilingual, bicultural, and diverse education in institutions of higher learning, including intellectual and professional advancement of deaf and hard of hearing individuals through the use of ASL and English. DeafSpace is important to Gallaudet's mission to creating those spaces and providing visual and tactile experiences in the environment on campus. Next slide, please. So let's have a little bit of fun. Take a look at this photo here and answer this poll. I'll give you just a minute to answer. Okay, let's go ahead and look at the poll results because I'm curious what the audience thinks about this photo. I commend you that most of you were prepared to dive into DeafSpace. Let's show the next slide. I'll give you time to read the slide that's in front of you. It's important that you note the word thump in the description of this photo. This gives you a hint that at the time, there were no formal deaf spaces. Deaf individuals have to have empathy with each other and then came up with this design to create a device that would thump on the floor because at the time there was no electricity or no doorbells. So this was a very clever solution. Next slide, please. So what is DeafSpace? I've inserted this image here so that you would take a moment to analyze it. This is a 360-degree view, and this gives you an idea of how deaf people rely on their vision in a way that's different from hearing people. Hearing people can hear things in their environment, whether they're behind them, in front of them, or to the sides, whereas deaf people have to rely on their vision for all aspects of information gathering. So DeafSpace is just a 16-year-old concept, but it started with the inspiration on how to respond to the deaf individual's unique way of being and the deaf community's unique way of being. We are unique people with a rich sense of the world, with increased visual and tactile needs. And so in considering DeafSpace, we look at how to incorporate that space into the culture. Next slide, please. Go ahead and take a moment to read this quote, please, by Le Corbusier. And I have an image on the next slide, if you would advance, that is an example of this. This image comes from Kendall Hall, which is in the historic district on Gallaudet's campus. This was erected in 1968, and this gives you an idea of what the building looks like and how the design is set up differently than a traditional classroom that you would find in a hearing space. Notice that the rows are not linear, but rather on a curve. And understanding the reasoning for this design, from my observation in this image, this is the correct design because it reflects an understanding of not only where the sun is oriented, so we avoid a glare. And you can see where the panel is on the left. And then to the north side, we also have a window that helps avoid glare. So it's fascinating how this is designed. Next slide, please. Here's another quote by Edward Hall. Next slide. Deaf culture operates in the same manner that of the quote you just read. Just like we have igloos that are architecturally perfect for the culture in which they serve, or caravan tents are perfect for people in which which inhabit them, we have unique spaces as well, as reflected in this image. This is from the Model Secondary School for the Deaf, circa 1970, and it's fascinating if you note the different arrangement of furniture. We've got a couple of chairs, we've got a couch, but notice how they're gathered together to create that conversation space. And this is a visual representation of our value in our visual links. Next slide, please. Now take a look at these two images. What do you think is wrong with these photos? Well, in the first photo on the left, the sidewalk is very narrow. So you've got three people who are using American Sign Language to communicate, but one person is unsafe by having to walk in the road. And then in the second photo, you'll notice that the table is rectangular. And there is not really a circular arrangement, which makes it very difficult for people to see each other. With these examples, if you were to visit Gallaudet University and there were no one around and you knew nothing about deaf culture and the university, you would design spaces like this. You wouldn't realize that it was a deaf campus and it's because the design and the buildings were mostly originally created by hearing people. Deaf people have increasingly become frustrated by those physical barriers to visual communication and connection, as well as the spatial relationship between spaces. And that's really unique to deaf culture. American Sign Language, or ASL, is extremely important. And I'll go over some history of the campus. When the campus was originally developed, it was very small. It was originally developed in 1867 and over the years up to 1949. The ASL vibrancy model was very strong because of the high density of students concentrated on campus. But then in the mid-century of the 1900s, 1950 to 1969, there was growth in the student population. ASL vibrancy was still very prevalent, but rubella then started spreading in the 1960s. So because of that, and because of the resulting increase in the deaf population because of rubella, that led to a rushed building of more campus buildings and more spaces on campus, but in doing so failed to understand our cultural values and ASL vibrancy. Over time, the enrollment of students stabilized, and because of that, we find that we now have time and space to address ASL vibrancy and rebuild our campus to a more conducive environment. Next slide, please. The first DeafSpace workshop was hosted in spring of 2005. What led us here was that the university administration was responding to DeafSpace by incorporating design for new campus buildings, and they named it the Sorensen Language and Communication Center, the SLCC. This is where we gathered to create the DeafSpace idea, and Hansel Ballman, who was a hearing architect, led collaborative workshops with the Gallaudet community. This phase of the project took 3 years to develop in order to establish policies and to apply those protocols then to DeafSpace. This then became an interdisciplinary project. When the SLCC opened in 2008, it incorporated the principles of DeafSpace, which you will see 5 designs in the video, and during Derek Beam's presentation. But our living document continues to be changed, modified, and edited because of the feedback we continually get from the deaf community. Let's watch 2 videos next. The first is a short film on DeafSpace. It's inside the deaf schools fight for civil rights. And the second video is how architecture changes for the deaf world. So please enjoy these next 2 videos.
I identify myself as a Black deaf woman. I'm Gallaudet Chapman. I'm from Washington, D.C. I'm a 5th-year student at Gallaudet University. I'm majoring in government and considering 2 minors, public health sciences and criminal justice. Maybe I'll run for Congress one day, you never know. All deaf individuals can do everything except hear. My first day, I was a little taken aback. I was taking it all in, you know, just introducing myself to people.
Gallaudet is unique because it's the only one of its kind in the world. I mean, the only one. It's the only university for deaf people that provides education designed specifically for deaf and hard of hearing students.
The first time, sometimes people meet a deaf person, they might feel overwhelmed, and then they'll just decide to, you know what, I don't even want to engage with this deaf person, but I am happy to pull out a pen and a piece of paper. I'm ready to communicate with anyone who wants to communicate with me. If there's even a guy who's hitting on me, we can write back and forth, that's fine. I can even navigate the dating scene, writing notes with someone who might be interested in me. So that doesn't bother me at all. Around 7 months old, something happened where I had a hearing loss. We're not sure if it was due to an illness, but after that, I became deaf. And so I began to learn ASL, got a cochlear implant, and that led me to who I am today. So I remember when I finally came into the deaf community. It was in high school, and I felt like the deaf community was something new to me, that there was this whole deaf world where everyone was signing, you know, everyone was communicating openly and freely with one another.
American Sign Language was first began by deaf people. American Sign Language is our language. Research has shown that many children would benefit from having access to a visual language, be they're deaf or hearing, and it adds a certain dimension to your brain in terms of the way your brain processes language. Gallaudet University was founded in 1864. So fast forward to 1988. At that time, Gallaudet was 124 years old. And in that 124 years, we had never had a deaf president lead this institution. My role 30 years ago has been one that I've carried with me throughout that time. I'm part of Gallaudet's history, something that we call Deaf President Now, DPN, which was a movement that happened here in DC, but it involved people throughout the country.
We picked Dr. Elizabeth Ann Zinsner as the 7th president of Gallaudet.
Gallaudet University had to have a deaf president because that was the whole purpose of the university's establishment in the first place, to advance educational opportunities, to advance the lives of people who were deaf. We closed the gates of the campus. We got a lot of media attention. We had rallies every day, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day, in fact. The effort grew, and it didn't just impact folks here in the United States, it went global. And all of that happened within one short week. We call that's the week the world heard Gallaudet.
I tendered my resignation last night to pave the way for the Board of Trustees to consider the selection of a president who is hearing impaired.
I am thrilled to accept the invitation of the Board of Trustees to become the president of Gallaudet University.
Today we can say that this is the proudest day in the history of deaf people.
We had won. We won. We had made it happen. You know, all that hard work can result in something that was successful, and we proved that to be the case, that we made this enormous impact. It was incredible.
We've made the first step. It's not over yet. This is just the beginning. And we'll keep on making steps until we run and run ahead until we succeed.
King had a famous quote.
Deaf people can do anything that hearing people can except hear.
And that quote was shared broadly.
DPN has inspired me, actually. What I learned was that deaf people really can do anything and everything, and that really inspired me to get involved in politics, because we don't have any deaf individual at this time serving in Congress. And I want to be the person that makes that happen. You know, maybe by the time I'm 25, who knows? I'm actually the only deaf member of my family. So I come from a hearing family. And I do remember my mom telling me that when she found out that I was deaf and had a hearing loss, she was a little taken aback at first. You know, of course, there's that grief that you experience because, you know, she didn't know what to do with a deaf child. Sometimes I felt lonely and isolated. You know, I was a deaf student in a hearing classroom and in a hearing environment. I actually went to 3 different programs for deaf students. The first that I attended was an oral program. That didn't work out. And then I stopped speech training when I was in middle school because, of course, I was a rebellious teenager at that point, right? I didn't want to use my cochlear implant. I thought I was perfectly fine. I knew who I was, and I didn't feel like I needed to hear. I didn't do that well in school. I was getting in trouble a lot. I wasn't able to participate and do well in class, finish my homework. But once I got to the school for the deaf, it was like night and day.
Because of the Milan decision back in 1880, from that point forward, deaf education really did not focus at all on sign language. Children were supposed to only focus on spoken language, and so deaf and hard of hearing children who were trying to sign to communicate with one another using their hands in any way for communication were punished. We grew up seeing stories shared by our parents about them going to work and coming home, having experienced discrimination in the workplace. And we could see yet how strong our parents were battling against oppression and making their way in the world, very strong-willed and believing that deaf people could do anything they set their mind to. The younger deaf population, the younger children these days, they don't know this story, and they need to have this story shared with them. It's true, I don't hear certain things that those of you who can hear are able to hear. And yet why should that be the focus on that deficit way of thinking, when instead we could focus on all the good that life brings to people who can't hear, the amazing things that people who are deaf have, as opposed to focusing on what it is they don't have.
This video is part of a larger series on the deaf community. Here are
6 local trains.
Stand clear of the closing doors, please.
We live in a world built for people who hear.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Live from NPR.
But what would our man-made world look like and feel like if it were designed for those who don't hear? Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C. is a school for the deaf and hard of hearing, and they are redesigning entire buildings based on the sensory experience of those who don't hear.
We've only just begun, though, to challenge ourselves to examine how we could design entire buildings, entire campuses, or even cities to be aligned with DeafSpace. Deaf people as a culture have been marginalized largely. We've been, as a marginalized community, developing our own culture, and that defines what kind of place we call home, how we claim and occupy space. And so we've begun to ask ourselves these questions, and because of that, gotten a lot more creative, begun to think bigger about how we can find different ways to align our ways of being to our environment. The classrooms are oriented in a semicircle or a U shape, so that classmates can continually visually connect with other classmates. So if you want to be involved in a discussion, everybody has a front row seat to seeing. In a wider hallway, 2 people can walk in parallel signing with each other, but we do have specific distance parameters wherein we can observe the whole body in its signing. Hearing people, though, could disregard that kind of a distance requirement. They can be just next to each other, speaking to each other without that need for the visual field. Stairs also require a great deal more visual attention to your footing. And so ramps reduce that. So if you're communicating with somebody while you're navigating a ramp, you can do so much more easily. Within DeafSpace, we have always relied on a heavily visible environment because we're not getting information auditorily. So if you're sitting at the top of the terrace, you can see all the way to the bottom of the terrace. It's one distinct place that can be unified or have three distinct areas. Color and lighting are highly aligned to communication access. Blues and greens will usually contrast with most skin tones enough to reduce eye strain. You may want to have more diffused lighting. A lot of the lighting here is directional so that it can be aligned. But there are mirrors present to allow somebody to know and have a sense of what's happening behind them. Through the use of that reflection, they can know if somebody is nearing them behind them, or if somebody taps them, they look up and that reflective space lets them know who's there. Transparency of, say, doorways, so that when a person is in an office, they can either have a transparent doorway or passageway, or one that's opaque, so that I can see lighting and shadow and movement, know that somebody's at the door, but not clearly see who's there. Very often, people refer to hearing loss as an example, which negatively frames the whole approach from the outset. But let's imagine the deaf baby who has never heard, and yet is still described as experiencing hearing loss. And instead, we propose a different framing, that of deaf gain. What is it that we gain by the experience of being or becoming deaf? DeafSpace, I believe, is born of the idea that we have something to offer the world, that being deaf confers some very interesting perspectives on life.
Hello, everyone. I'm so happy that you all could join us today in this presentation. And some of you may already be familiar about DeafSpace. For some of you, it could be new. Both films that we just shared really just highlights the sense of ownership that we truly value at Gallaudet University. And that being because deaf people have a place that we call home. And we've called this place home for many years. And just like Bridget mentioned in the video, there was not a deaf president until DPN happened. Then a deaf president was finally selected, and that gives us that sense of ownership, pride, and connection with our president. That fight to right of existence and to claim our own space and to make process and progress in terms of accessibility just simply adds value in our lives. And those fights are still remaining and going on today. I think the second video talks about deaf gain, which is what it talked about in the end of the video, where I believe that we think that we have something to offer. Our experience can then become a value add for hearing people to benefit from as well. I think the lesson in that is changing the perspective on deaf people. One of the girls in the film mentioned that she grew up attending an oral program and then tried various programs after that. And all experiences that she had were based on hearing people trying to dictate how and what normal meant and what kind of environment we should be living in. The film argues that our buildings are always designed by hearing people for hearing people. And they're not designed by deaf individuals for deaf individuals. Or you could argue designed for everyone. So there's a lot of design elements that have already come up in the past, be it 15 years since 2005, which is when the DeafSpace concept was coined as a term. And as you probably know, Chris mentioned, DeafSpace has been around for much, much longer than 2005, but it became something that was formalized. Research and analysis was given to the topic, and it becomes something that we give to the world. And that's only been in the last 15 years where DeafSpace has become a buzzword. People are starting to ask what DeafSpace is, what it looks like, and we have 100 attendees here today who are curious to learn what DeafSpace is. The first thing that I want to share that it's not simply about accessibility for deaf people. Rather, it's about values that the deaf community has. So I think it's important to talk about some of those values that both films did highlight. We value a collective and transparent process. Oftentimes, we don't have access to things like meetings, government agencies, representation. That's lacking for a lot of us as the deaf community. And so when the time comes where we are given the chance to lead in something like a design process or the construction of our own home, for example, we take that opportunity and we really value a transparent process. And so we've seen that at Gallaudet University, where our deaf president which again was demanded by deaf students, and where our students demanded transparency in things like policy changes and decision making, because we value communication. If we have access in the process and we are included in the process, that allows for our sense of identity to develop, and it allows for us to have a position in the space and being a part of the process. And that's something that I am personally fascinated in. My background is in urban planning, and we do include the community that we're working with because we have to understand what a unique community needs in the design process, what the current resources are, and how do we capitalize on what's currently there. So if deaf people are a part of the process, that then allows the deaf people to get a sense of ownership because they are there from the beginning in the planning stages. So that's what I'm excited about today in today's presentation, to see architects who have come to Gallaudet University, who has engaged students and worked alongside faculty, students, staff, and the community to learn and understand our culture, and then to allow deaf people to have a larger role in the design process. Architects are not necessarily experts in the deaf culture, just as the same is true as the deaf community may not be experts in architecture, but they have a sense of ownership in what's actually being built. And throughout time, I think it's important to have deaf representation, not only in the design process, but throughout the entire realm of things like politics, governance, programming, operations. Deaf people should be represented in all facets. So having a deaf president leading Gallaudet University is only one example of representation. And like the student mentioned in the film, we still don't have deaf politicians that have been appointed to Congress. Or even a higher level in the government. So what does that mean? When we're thinking about policy, when we're thinking about planning, design processes, accessibility, not having deaf people lead in those positions does have an impact. It's still an uphill battle for us all. Ultimately, if we have the things that we are requesting, we are going to have a nurturing environment. It becomes a place that is supportive, that values our experiences, and treasures how we live. When we do have a nurturing environment, that then allows for us to do a lot more in order to give back to society. So it's not something that needs to be corrected. That is not who we are or what we need as a community. We want you to view us as a nurturing component of a larger society where we have agency in improving our own lives. Next slide, please. Of course, you as architects will probably be very curious about how this applies to your own work. I know that there are guidelines for DeafSpace and that concept, but to help you break down this concept into parts, there are 3 factors of DeafSpace design. and the inclusion process. Those three factors that you have to consider are the sensory reach, which essentially means my body as a deaf person and my experience as a deaf person. How can I have continuous awareness of my environment? How do I experience the world? Because I don't hear, I experience the world in a different way. The next component is visual language. This should also include tactile, but it's based on signing visual language. So as a person who signs, I take up a little bit more space. I equate this to hearing people who may speak very loudly, who have a higher octave of volume. They typically are able to dominate or take up a little bit more space as compared to someone who may be a little bit more of a meek or softer spoken person. So how voice can capture space is also true in using our signing space. As a signer, I need more space to communicate. That also applies to Zoom. I have meetings with hearing people on Zoom, and you see them only showcasing the very top of their head, you know, but me as a deaf person, I have to show my entire upper body. So I'm thinking about what that frame looks like in accessibility. And so using that concept of how that impacts space. And then the third part is deaf culture. So when deaf people are able to have a sense of ownership of a particular space long enough, you will start to see unique deaf culture components show up in that area. Now, how that space is fostered will then allow for the deaf culture to thrive in that space. You can see this in deaf art, gathering spaces, social spaces, and things like that. So these are the three general concepts that you can start to think about when applying deaf space design principles. Next slide. So deaf space design guidelines were developed in 2005, and it was developed in partnership with Gallaudet University and an architect by the name of Hoffmann. And Hansel is a hearing person, and his brother also works at Gallaudet University. He works in the ASL Deaf Studies department and has worked there for many years. So Hansel's fascination with the deaf community and deaf culture was from the frame of an architect. He wanted to find and explore ways and identify different types of design elements that actually supported the deaf way of being. So in other words, what a deaf person's lived experience would be and how does that show up in a physical space? So he identified 5 different categories. The first category is space and proximity. And that really ties into visual communication. And that's what sets it apart when you're looking at a comparison between hearing people and how they use space and deaf people. It's not simply about what you can hear, but it's about your visual space and visual acuity in a given space. That's visual space is really important for us to communicate. And that becomes a chief focus for us when we're designing spaces. We value things like eye contact. For example, in this classroom design, and it was also mentioned in the Vox video, a classroom will typically be designed in a semicircle. So everyone essentially has a front row seat and can give eye contact to any other person in the room. That again fosters a deaf culture environment. The same thing is true when you're walking alongside a friend outside in a hallway. We have to have a wider space so that we can remain connected via eye contact while we sign. This also applies to private spaces. If there are open spaces everywhere, then that means I have access to any kind of private conversation that could be happening in my eyesight. And so some deaf people do like the ability to control their space and have a more intimate conversation with someone that they're speaking with. So they may create some sort of a barrier so that people cannot see from behind to see what they're saying. So we've been studying different degrees of enclosures. And that's the goal being to help us understand what the purpose of a space is and how that ties into the use of space. So again, using the example of a classroom, it's going to have a very different design as compared to a dorm room. You're not going to want everyone to be able to see each other in a dorm room. You may have different social experiences and expectations in a dorm room. So there are many design elements that we have looked into to think about what it means for space and proximity. Next slide, please. So sensory reach, I mentioned this a little bit earlier as one of the main factors of the deaf design space. How I experience an environment is typically through visual cues, vibrations, and several other ways that I experience the environment. So this picture is an indicator where a person is sitting at a desk in an office and might be able to identify a vibration zone. So you know that somebody has approached the door. And so it's the goal being is you don't want a deaf person to be in a working project and then be unprepared when somebody walks into the room. So if there is a vibration zone when somebody approaches the doorway, that will communicate to the deaf person that somebody has then come into the doorway and then be able to invite this person into the office. It's a simple thing, but it goes a long way when it's the goal being is to connect people. And we want to do so with how I, as a deaf person, experience an environment. So I would equate this to how hearing people may hear somebody approaching, hear somebody's footsteps when they approach a doorway. So for spatial orientation is essentially how I make sense of where I am in a given environment. Wayfinding, signs could be part of that. There's actually several different design elements when you're considering spatial orientation. One fascinating part about sensory reach is that often the deaf community will share a sensory reach experience. So we, like I said, we don't hear some background noise that might be happening. But if I'm sitting with another person and I'm having a conversation with them, oftentimes that person will become part of my sensory reach. So for example, if I'm making eye contact with a person across a table and I see a person look behind me because something is happening behind me, I may not necessarily be able to see what's happening behind me, but knowing that this person has changed their eye gaze, that communicates to me that something is happening behind me. In addition to that, part of the deaf culture experience is that the person that I'm speaking with will let me know what's happening behind me. It could be something interesting that deserves my attention, or it could be to simply tell me to move out of the way because somebody is trying to walk in our path. Another example is when two people are walking down a hallway or down a sidewalk and they're communicating with each other. One person will communicate to the person they're speaking with that there may be a barrier in the way to avoid stepping on something or to avoid hitting a pole or a corner of a wall. So it's a deaf culture norm to communicate that sensory reach experience to the person that you're in a conversation with. There is another film that I'm going to be showing you here in a few minutes that will make that point again. If that is not currently clear, hopefully the video will help drive that point home. And third, mobility. It's fascinating how we move through a given space and how we are able to maintain connection while we walk through a space. So this is one picture that's an example of a tree-lined sidewalk that indicates rhythm. So if I'm having a conversation with another person and I'm walking down this path, I'm going to use these trees as cues to tell me that I can continue to walk down this sidewalk. If a tree is no longer present, that will tell me that I'm approaching an intersection. And that indicates to me that I need to direct my attention to what's in front of me. So you can use environmental cues to make a person feel comfortable to engage in a conversation with someone or not. And so mobility is particularly fascinating. In the video that I'm going to show you, there's a difference between hearing people and deaf people and how we simply walk. So I'm going to let you watch the video now. And what I want you to notice is first, deaf people with, they're wearing a GoPro camera on their heads. And this was a research project that was done in 2008, I believe, we asked these deaf people, these participants, to go out on a walk on H Street, which is here in Northeast DC near Gallaudet University. So I want you to just take particular mention of what that looks like. You'll see these green lines. That shows the peripheral vision of the people who are wearing the GoPro. And you can see how often the deaf person shows up in their periphery. You can see the other individuals wearing their GoPro on their head. So we asked hearing people to do the exact same thing. Obviously, they're using spoken English to communicate, and this is what it looks like. I want you to notice how often the person that they're communicating with shows up in the frame. So obviously you can see it does, the person that they're having a conversation with does not show up as much. And so I think that that research is very simplistic in nature, but it is fascinating to see just how often another person shows up within the periphery vision. So when you have a conversation with another deaf person, it is so often that we're actually looking at them while we're having a conversation with them, even while we're moving. When we're looking at that other person, it's not always directly in front of us. It could be out of our peripheral vision. So what that tells us is that space and proximity is applicable to this particular instance. So two deaf people may stand a little bit further apart and then will communicate to each other when there are barriers in the way, and they will rely on the peripheral vision to make sure to denote those barriers. When two hearing people are having a conversation, they're simply looking straight ahead. They're looking at the sidewalk or what's in front of them. And I think that drives home the point how important well-designed spaces are. We want to reinforce deaf people to be able to have that connection, to maintain that conversation with the people that they're walking down a sidewalk with. I'd also like to talk about the fourth element. I should mention here that my room that I'm sitting in has really terrible lighting. I have a window right beside me, and so I'm trying to avoid the sunlight glaze shining in from the window, and I have to apologize to the interpreter. That makes it a little bit more difficult for the interpreter to see me. If you can back up one slide, please. That kind of ties into my next point in my presentation. Chris also mentioned this in his remarks. In a classroom, when you're looking at a teacher, you certainly don't want the teacher to be standing in front of a window or have some kind of light behind them. And the same is true in the deaf community. We often will want to go out to eat at a restaurant, and we will intentionally pick a restaurant, not simply for its good food, but we want to make sure that the waiter is friendly and can easily communicate with deaf people. But most importantly, lighting. Lighting is the most important factor. We want to think about what the lighting looks like in that restaurant. Is it bright enough to have a good conversation or not? Are the lighting elements coming from an overhead light, or is lighting coming from windows? And if it's coming from windows, that makes it really difficult to sit around a table and have someone sitting in front of a window. It becomes a backlighting issue. So the deaf community has several considerations that we inherently know that can tell us if a restaurant is designed well or not, because we are thinking about the considerations of communication. And it's simply to reduce eye strain and to make sure that we can continue to enjoy ourselves and have a positive experience. Next slide, please. And finally, I think is most interesting, sound acoustics. Deaf people actually do have some level of hearing. Most of them do. Not every deaf person is completely and profoundly deaf. People can hear certain levels and certain decibels. Some people have hearing aids, some people have cochlear implants. And what's interesting about hearing aids, cochlear implants, and other hearing devices is that it's not like glasses. Someone who wears glasses may be able to see clearly and essentially achieve 20/20 vision. And they often think that any kind of hearing device will achieve the same goal. But the range is so much greater and it is much more complicated. So when somebody gets a hearing device, they may be able to hear certain pitches, certain tones, and certain things will bother them more than other sounds. So for example, I use a hearing aid and I can hear the refrigerator humming, but I cannot mentally filter out and tune out that sound. I can hear it humming constantly, and that wears me out sometimes. I don't want to hear that all of the time. And so I asked my hearing brother if he heard the refrigerator humming and if he was equally annoyed as I was. And my brother had to think for a second, pause, and then he was able to recognize that he heard the refrigerator humming, but he's able to filter it out easily, where I cannot. I hear it, and it's like a bombardment of sound constantly. So when it comes to design, acoustics is vitally important. Sound barriers and how to mitigate sound distractions for people who use hearing devices are really important considerations. Okay, and so next we are going to switch back to Christopher Hoffman, who is going to talk about some applications and some exciting projects that are happening at Gallaudet. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm going to quickly touch on a couple of different projects happening on Gallaudet's campus. I'll just briefly go over these, and I would love to welcome you all to campus to see these projects in person, but unfortunately, because of the pandemic, we're not able to do that. But at least what we can do is show you some images of these projects. This is what I mentioned earlier, the DeafSpace campus building. And in this slide, you have seen some of these images from the beginning film that I shared. This became a very successful project, but even though in its success, we still have learned lessons from it. Because of the building and the extent of drywall in the atrium area, it actually ended up causing reflections or sound reverberations that were causing problems for those with hearing aids and cochlear implants. Next slide, please. Oh, thank you. Oh, next slide after this, please. Can you go back one, please? This one, thank you. Five years ago, we managed to renovate some of the interior spaces, specifically with the science, technology, and math building. And this is a good example of how unique different types of spaces can be. The lab, if you can see in the larger picture on the right, is designed to fit a visual means of communication. The way the space is established, we set up a mock-up in a warehouse. And then what we did was we set cameras up around the periphery of that warehouse area so that we could run a mock experiment to see how that space would operate in the real space. And what this did is empowered the students, faculty, and staff to have input in creating this space. We do have several examples of DeafSpace. I'm not going to point out everything because we are limited on time, but if you could go to the next slide, please. So these slides reflect, on the left-hand side, you'll see the space before the renovation and the same space post-renovation. And this was the fast track project because what happened was we got donations which then delineated the project, which then outlined the project requirements. And we had to use those funds in order to renovate these spaces by a certain deadline. We were inviting people to come to Gallaudet University to see what the university is all about. And in going back to our mission of a bilingual, bicultural space, as you'll see in the bottom right-hand corner, we have different professions listed on those various boards. And we have small video screens inset into those boards that have sign language representation on them describing each of the cultural values that Gallaudet University espouses. And we also have, for the deafblind people, we have tactile readers for them as well. Next slide, please. This is an exciting project. This is the first all-inclusive changing room. What's unique, we listened to what was unique about deaf culture and what was different about deaf culture, and we wanted to incorporate the expertise of the deaf culture and take that all the way into the locker room. And we accomplished this space here. This space includes everything, it is inclusive of everything from small children to those who use wheelchairs. It also respects religious differences and also is able to serve senior citizens. So we have showers, for example, that have fold down seats. We also have foot washing stations for the Muslim citizens and students on our campus. So we have a variety of spaces on our campus. Next slide, please. This slide shows a project that we recently finished and unveiled last fall. If you see on the left-hand bottom side, there is a community space here and what that space looked like before. We gave different finish boards and had deafblind people touch these boards for different finishes that we were highlighting for our new space, and wanted to reinforce that texture and tactile experience for them in this new space. So if you see in the right-hand corner, we have stops for those who navigate with a cane, or in fall of 2019, we incorporated the marketplace here. And in the winter of 2020, because of COVID-19 and this pandemic that we're in, everyone was locked out of the building and we had to hold off on that project. So we wanted to accomplish the project. We managed to do it through a series of Zoom meetings, and it's amazing that we could even pull off this project during the pandemic and how we've approached this building project. But this is an excellent example of multiple tactile experiences. Next slide, please. In the left photo, you'll see that the space that we're looking at here is darker, a little more somber. But on the right, that same space is much more brightly lit and much more respective of ASL vibrancy. Next slide. And this will be my last one, and I'll turn it over to Megan. I think it's important here to highlight the effect that our vibrancy has had outside of Gallaudet's campus. So there is a Starbucks and a Mozzaria Pizza on H Street in Washington, D.C. And these two outside entities have incorporated deaf design in their space. So it's important, I think it's important, and I would encourage you to go visit those two places as well. Megan? take it away.
Hi, everyone. I'll wait till my camera comes up. It should be on. Hi, everyone. Next slide, please. And you can go to the next one. So we're running short on time, so I'm going to go through quickly. We already know the background of Gallaudet, Washington. It's north of the Capitol. It's right in the heart of the city, so we'll move forward. The historic part of the campus is towards the south. It has a mixture of buildings dating over the last 120 years, 30 years. The building that Quinn Evans worked on was the Learning and Living Residence Hall number 6 right here. It is set on the campus green, so it's right in the heart of the campus and right in the cultural heart, because this is the media center. So there's a lot of interaction on this campus green. Next slide. Really briefly, this is an example of the historic architecture and the historic part of the campus. Move forward, please. And the more recent architecture is mid-century modern with brick architecture, punched windows. So there's really a variety of architectural styles. We can move on to the next one. So when we were awarded this was a design competition, and we were awarded the project, the university set up a design committee, which isn't all that different from a lot of projects. It was comprised of campus planners, faculty, students, and caretakers. But what the difference with Gallaudet is the amount of access to student representatives and faculty, especially the student population. This project and the other project that we did at Gallaudet was designed by hearing architects and engineers. So we had very limited experience with the deaf community. So having that ability to have these design committees with deaf students and deaf faculty really helped us inform the design. This image down here below is one of the many presentations that we did of various massings for the dormitory. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, the residence hall is on completing the rectangle of the campus green. Missing from this image is the learning center. It's not shown here, but it is right here in the middle of the campus. And so there is a lot of activity across the campus green, going in and out of the building, and connection to this space was critical for the design committee. The other priorities that they asked us to engage in was establishing a grand communicating stair through the building, adding a central kitchen and lounge on each floor to encourage floor-by-floor student gathering. And the first floor had a retail space with a coffee shop, some study spaces, a large gathering space, kind of living room type area, lecture rooms, and then a collaboration space. You can go to the next slide. The concept that we went with was this idea of 2 bars sliding back and forth from each other. As I mentioned, the first floor is the more public floor and more public meeting spaces and classrooms. The upper floors were the dormitory spaces. And what is pretty unique to Gallaudet is that there are 4 faculty apartments, 1 on each floor. The deaf community is a very tight community, as you've seen in some of these videos today. And Gallaudet really wanted to encourage the learning and living type of community by having faculty live with the students. Next slide, please. So from the exterior, how does deaf architecture come through on the building? And these are some of the images that are pulled from the Gallaudet DeafSpace architecture guidelines, where establishing building entrances along major paths, establishing view corridors, and highlighting social spaces from the exterior. You can see that large glass block in the middle of the building there. That's the lounge area on each of the residence floors that indicate that that's a more public use to the exterior viewer. And as I go through this presentation, you'll notice that not many of these concepts are exclusive to deaf culture. These are very easy concepts to incorporate into any architectural space. Next slide, please. As Derek and Chris were mentioning earlier, having rhythmic placement or trees or columns or pilasters along the facade of the building at the lower end helped establish visual anchors while walking and signing. The grade here slopes, and do I need to pause for the interpreter, or are we okay? Okay, I'm just making sure. So on either side of the columns is the walkway. So that helps the user as they're walking through the building to establish those visual anchors while walking and signing. Next slide, please. This floor plan shows you the connections in and out of the building. If you look at the northern part of the building, that's the large collaboration space. It has a flexible space where students could move walls and develop different seating arrangements. The space, I don't have control of the cursor, so I'm sorry here. In the living room space, it's tiered off to the right there. It moves with the site and it allows for multiple views as you go through the space into other parts of the living space. If you come forward another slide, you'll be able to see this space a little bit better. This plan really highlights the view from interior to exterior space, and being able to view from the outside all the way through the building. Views from one space to another is very important, as Chris and Derek were explaining, for not only knowing where you are, but for safety. Being able to see people coming and going is an important factor. Next slide, please. So this is that large living room space that's in the first floor area. And as you can see, it's is on tiers, but also there's a ramp connecting the spaces, which allows for ease of movement and signing and walking at the same time. And this space also has a lot of flexible seating arrangements to allow for conversation. Next slide. And so on this slide, Derek has a short story he wanted to tell about this space and how it's been used since the building had opened. So I'm going to give Derek the floor briefly.
And I'll be really brief. This is one of my favorite stories about this particular building. When we were in the design phases, we included the students, and the students were sharing some of their wishes. They created a wish list, and some of them were pretty outlandish, but some of them were really great. One was wanting to have a theater space, but also private meeting space. But being limited to just that particular square footage and that particular space was tough. But what you can see here in this video is an auditorium full of people. If all of the people were there in that room were looking in one direction, they can see a presentation at the bottom, that last tiered space. You can see the professor right there at the very bottom. However, if you go back one slide, now if this is a quieter version of the same space, people will use those little cubicles as private meeting spaces. So if somebody that is walking in from the very back of the room, you would not be able to see what's happening in those individual cubicles or what they're talking about. You might be able to see the tops of their heads, but that's it. So in other words, this creates a sense of privacy, but also being an open space all in one. And how we were able to do that is to leverage this tiered terrain. So that idea actually came from the interaction and dialogues with the students and trying to work on how to provide the most while using the least amount of resources. DeafSpace was an answer to this particular wish list item. I thought that was really neat.
Okay, go ahead into the next slide. And I apologize if I'm sounding very rushed. I do want to make time for questions here. This next slide really demonstrates the ability to have those circular seating areas and conference rooms that we've been talking about, views from one space to another. The use of windows allows for reflections and detection of movement. So that is also helpful in DeafSpace architecture. Please move ahead. This is the collaboration space, which is located at the north end of the building. And it has movable walls that are on a track. So this allowed the students to move the walls all the way to the end where they can make one big gathering space or create smaller, more intimate gathering spaces with various table arrangements to set up different type of meeting environments. And the next slide will show another seating arrangement and some photographs of the space. Go ahead to the next one. On the upper levels, where the residence halls are resident rooms, they're connected by a large lounge area right off the open stair that has a shared kitchen facing the lounge. And the opposite corner is that faculty apartment that encourages learning and living together. Next slide, please. So here is the large open stair, and we've had a number of examples in this presentation where having a wide stair, you'll notice that the treads are deeper. It allows for much easier conversation as you're going up and down the stairs. Having the open stair have views to all the different levels allows for being able to see people coming and going in a more safe environment. Next slide, please. So this is the shared lounges on each floor. You can see that there's a kitchen over there where that small group is gathering. And what's key in this image is that the kitchen island is facing outward, not just for conversation, but also for safety. So the cooking surface, the sink is facing outward so that you don't have a student who's using the cooking surface, have someone come walk up behind them and startle them and have an accident. We've also used color as a wayfinding and contrast for being able to orient yourself within the building. There's flexible seating for conversation areas. The hallways are much larger and wider than a typical dormitory. And as you can see right there at the kitchen, there's the windows there allow view into the space, but also a soft intersection so you can see people coming around the corner. Next slide, please. This is a couple more images of the upper levels of the living space. We've created a lot of seating areas where there can be intimate conversation, a variety of seating areas. If you look at the image that has the green, it's a corridor with the green, yes, that one. We've created these little seating nooks at the entrances to some of the student rooms, allowing for places to sit or engage in conversation. If you have something in your hand, you can put it down and engage in conversation a little bit easier. So having these places to be able to stop and have conversation is also a nice principle of DeafSpace. The entrances are also, oh, please go back, thank you. The entrances are also recessed into the hallway because that creates like a little conversation niche so that people can pull aside on the hallway to continue the conversation. Go ahead to the last slide. Finally, we're getting into the individual dorm room for each student. And this is where the reducing the amount of color helps with visual calmness. Having a neutral palette in the dorm room does allow for the student to do some personalization, but it also reduces the amount of visual noise, if you will. So it allows for a more calm space, whereas the colors were more in the public, active, lively spaces. In the upper left corner of the slide, you can see some test colors of various colors that we were using in construction. Gallaudet, not on this project, but in the past has done a number of test samples throughout the university where they were testing various colors as to serve as a backdrop for signing and what was ideal. And this is a continuation of that type of concept and making sure that we selected the right colors for the project. So very quickly, that was the Learning and Living Residence Hall. I wanted to make sure we had some time to answer questions.
Thank you, Megan, Chris, and Derek. That was fantastic to listen to and watch. We are running a little short of time, so we're going to move to just the Q&A portion for the event. And please feel free, everyone listening in, to add in questions you may have. I'll start reading them. So one I see, are there efforts to establish guidelines and requirements to accommodate needs for the deaf community, or are there efforts to create a more integrated approach? Maybe Derek, you can start with that, or I don't know, Chris, whoever thinks would be better.
Sure. That's a great question, and I get asked that question quite frequently. I think one of the things we're trying to ascertain is what is the overlap between universal design and DeafSpace, as well as the human-centered design approach. And in those three arenas, we do see quite a bit of overlap, but with a slightly different focus. One thing that I mentioned about DeafSpace is DeafSpace values and how those values include deaf people in the design process. That aspect is very specific to the deaf community, to people who sign, to people who have different sensory experiences compared to the rest of the population. And in our research, we gave deaf people a space to research, to explore, and architectural qualities that fit those needs. Whereas in universal design is focused on how to make everything not just more accessible, but beneficial for people of a variety of abilities and backgrounds. So that is an extremely top-down approach where we identify a specific set of standards and certain design elements that may benefit people of all different abilities. Human-centered design is focused on the client, and that tends to be specific to a geographic area or region or a specific purpose for building use. So in reality, if you want to design something very well, you should definitely consider universal design. However, you should also consider some elements of human-centered design approaches when you strive to understand the unique needs of the community for whom you're building. Now, when it comes to deaf users, you should definitely incorporate DeafSpace in your process and incorporate deaf people in your process of design. I'm often asked by people who say, okay, well, I'm a designer in the middle of this small town and I don't know of any deaf people in my area. So why would I consider DeafSpace? Or how would they find deaf people to incorporate into their research project, into the research phase? And that's a great question. And I will reflect back, why is DeafSpace important for you to include then in your project? And what we need to do is explore how to do that. But I want to ask the purpose of why you want to include that if you don't have any deaf members in your community. I want to raise that question because occasionally, sometimes people often do choose the community they'd like to live in based on various factors: schools, education systems, the community, the population. And the deaf community tends to live in what we call hubs that tend to be close to deaf schools. So we give more consideration to residing in those areas than we would to any other area. But for accessibility, you should incorporate accessibility into your building for everyone if you're building in a general area that is not a deaf hub. So universal design really should be your approach most of the time. DeafSpace is how you might improve the quality of the deaf experience and deaf lives through the use of the space you're building. It actually is more noble to apply DeafSpace with the intention of really lifting and elevating that deaf experience. I know I'm rambling on and on. I'll let another person add their perspective.
Well, we could try, we have time for maybe one more question, unfortunately, before we wrap up at 2. So I see one about asking, the large open spaces have so many hard surfaces. How do you keep the sound from being too loud, like Derek mentioned, so you don't overwhelm folks with hearing aids, etc.? Chris, would that be a question for you, or Megan?
I can answer part of that.
I open it to you.
You know, it's the balance between easily cleanable surfaces for a large building with a lot of users. There's a lot of sound insulation in the walls. There's a lot of acoustic absorption in the ceilings. So it was a delicate balance. So that's when you're balancing facilities versus acoustics.
And if I may add to that, to Megan's comment, you're right. I think it's very important to have a design with consideration to the type of space you're going to, what you're going to utilize the space for. So if you're designing an auditorium, you will want to bring in people with different expertise and different fields of knowledge where they can analyze the acoustics and the design of the space. And that's an important collaboration. And that speaks to the uniqueness of the project itself.
I have to ask one last question because I think it's important, and then we'll officially wrap up. From Joe, these guidelines and solutions in general seem like good design that would benefit everyone. Are there any DeafSpace guidelines that conflict with other universal design concepts or even standard building codes? I open that up to Derek and Chris. Megan, I think it can really be.
I know that when we were, and this ties into someone else's question with the fire alarm strobes, and this also helped. The amount of flashing is an issue beyond deaf culture, and so that was an issue. Tying in the fire alarm system in the dormitory, the students can have what's called a bed shaker under their bed to alert them that the fire alarm is activated. There was also, but this is more towards all design. It is a large concept of having openness and open stairs and atriums. That's more general architecture. It's a DeafSpace principle, but it does conflict with fire marshals wanting to enclose everything and make it nice and tight and fireproof. So that's a conflict, but that's a typical conflict, I think, with many spaces in architecture.
And if I could just chime in and add one more thing. The same principles apply to LEED guidelines. Those guidelines mention that everything should be bright and white, but that's not conducive to deaf spaces because the more reflectivity there is in our surfaces, the more visually distracting and disturbing that is. So we opted for gentler hues that would be less reflective. So again, an interesting point. I think the conflict happens when you look at DeafSpace compared to other elements, when you look at building codes compared to other elements. But if you look at the holistic approach of many of the designs that are out there, you'll often find a solution to those conflicting codes. So for example, the sidewalks, I agree, the pathways, the bright light can be an issue, but we can create filtered light. We can consider a tree canopy. What types of trees might grow fastest to provide that? So there could be other solutions out there. So for every problem, I believe there is always a solution. And DeafSpace is also about incorporating those solutions and finding those solutions, just like we mentioned with the Living and Learning Residence Hall. We found solutions and it worked out beautifully.
So thank you everyone for attending. Thank you to our sponsors, Gallaudet University, MDN Architects, and HCM. Thank you so much to our wonderful panelists, Chris, Derek, and Megan, as well as our interpreters that was mentioned in the Q&A that you too were invaluable to this event. Thank you to our partner AIA Virginia, staff at AIA Nova, and our CAE committee members. A quick heads up before we sign out, we will be having another event coming up called Equity in Public Schools, Supporting Our Communities with School Design on June 2nd. And this will be a wonderful event focusing on equity from a K-12 perspective. And we'll be hearing from 3 major school districts, Alexandria Public Schools, Baltimore City Public Schools, and PG County Public Schools. If any of you are interested in getting more involved with the CAE Nova or have any other questions, feel free to reach out to us at cae@aianova.org. Have a great rest of your afternoon.